Well, Thomas, thanks for joining me and talking for a little bit. I know some background. We met in 2015 in Nepal, and I was a young photographer running around. That was probably my first real natural disaster covering where it felt like the entire world was looking onto what was happening in Nepal. And met you. You were really nice. You had some good talking points about covering and just traveling and being a photographer in general. And so, can you tell me just a little bit about your background and what you've been working on, in the past, and just give a little bit about who you are?
Sure. It's funny because for the past 15 years, I've spent about 6 months of every year traveling and working internationally. But I grew up very isolated in Montana, which was a great place to grow up. Love the mountains,
Right.
love the West. But I was also pretty eager to get out. And so I grew up there, went to school back east, and wound up in journalism school in Montana. And after journalism school, worked at a newspaper for a year, small town paper. Great experience. Was a reporter, photographer, and through a weird connection, got offered a job at CNN. I never thought about doing television, although I was kind of primed for it. You can relate to this. I'm a little older than you, so back in the day, I mean, I just missed the digital video revolution
Right.
by a few years, right? Like in school, we bought a high eight camera and drove down to Mexico and made our first documentary, kayaking over 30-foot waterfalls. And it was a glorious failure, right? We didn't do anything with it, but the experience just
Right.
whetted our appetite. So fast forward, I finished this year in Montana at the small town paper and went to work at CNN on the writing producing track, but I missed being out in the field. So I think you can relate to this. The shortest way for me to get to the field was to learn how to shoot and edit and report my own stuff. And that's exactly when kind of the whole digital video revolution took hold, right? So I threw a nice Apple laptop on my credit card, learned Final Cut Pro, bought
Yeah.
a consumer grade one chip camera, and paid someone to shoot my stand up and went that route. And that opened up all kinds of doors. And I quit as a staffer at CNN and started getting interesting freelance assignments covering wildfires out west. I was a war reporter in Iraq in 2003.
Oh, that's right.
And that actually led to one of my bosses was hired at UNICEF after the war. And he called me up out of the blue one day and said, "Hey, man, well, why don't you come work for me and I'll send you around the world for a couple of years." And at that point, the war reporting wasn't going to be as interesting in the years right after 2003. There was kind of a calm period.
Right.
I could have had plenty of work just like, just tending the post, right?
Exactly.
Like maybe something would happen, maybe something wouldn't. So I said, okay, sure, this sounds pretty interesting. And here we are. That was, I think I started 2004, and here we are in 2020. And I'm still doing some work as a freelancer for UNICEF, but also still, I just spent 6 months in the Congo, 6 months straight, working every day, covering COVID, covering climate change, covering the end of Ebola in the east, and then it sprung up in the northwest. I mean, the Congo is a never-ending supply of stories. Actually, there was a couple weeks of natural disaster stories thrown in there. We had a huge flood that wiped out 3 bridges, and we had to fly in on helicopters.
Crazy.
So yeah, man. The past 15 years have been kind of a split between doing freelance work for UN organizations or different organizations, and I do some stuff for the New York Times from time to time, doing video, doing some photography. I show up on CNN, I don't know, 4 or 5 times a year, and it's been a great way to see the world. I'm sure you can relate to that. I mean, since I left Montana, more than 100 countries. So it's
Right.
been a great experience. And of course, we met through Dave Darg in Nepal.
Right.
And it was just through a fluke. I was actually based at the time in Kathmandu. I was in a coffee shop on the second floor working on editing a story from Bangladesh. I was working on a series in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and India and Nepal when the earthquake hit.
Oh, so
So
you were there.
I was there,
Oh, I didn't
and
realize that.
yeah,
Wow.
that was one of the craziest days of my life, right? Like it was an insane week,
Yeah.
starting with the earthquake.
I was in I was me and Christian we were in Iraq filming mainly in Sinjar where it was no really I'm sure US was helping with like flying drones around, but they weren't bombing at that point. Like the still Sinjar city was completely controlled by ISIS and we were like in the mountain and then Nepal hit and we went from there straight to Kathmandu like the day after or something like
Uh,
that. And yeah, that was a crazy. That was kind of that, and I was in the Mosul operation. But as far as like Mosul operation had certain points where everyone would focus on it, but Nepal to me still felt like is weird being at a location or something event happens where it does feel like the whole you kind of feel the whole world is paying attention to it and you just have that feeling, I that's how I kind of felt when I was in Nepal.
so many people too have a personal connection to Nepal. I mean, the devastation in Haiti was a lot greater,
Oh
and
yeah.
I spent years going back and forth more than 50 times to Haiti. I had an apartment in Port-au-Prince. I still have a motorcycle there a friend of mine takes care of. But Nepal, especially the historic section there on the edge of Tamil and some of the, centuries old
Hmm.
structures that were destroyed. I mean, people really kind of, I think, could relate a bit more.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the Signa Pachu district area, really close to the Tibet border, in that area, because there was a lot of destruction in the old city, but a lot of it was in those remote villages, really difficult places to get to, even without an earthquake or blocking. And
Really.
so it was, I know, for a lot of journalists and for a lot of organizations, if you didn't have helicopters or the proper vehicles, like you're staying in Kathmandu, man. Like,
Yeah, forget it. Forget it. I know a friend of mine got the photographer James Knockway onto a helicopter, and he got some amazing photographs that nobody else could touch because the roads were destroyed. The entire village, I mean, there were entire villages, as you know, that were destroyed, like nothing left standing. And
hmm
so I think a lot of people saw the footage from Kathmandu and said, "Oh, it's not that bad." But then if you go to the outlying areas, you have entire villages that were just
yeah,
wiped off
wiped
the.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you have you when's the last time you've been back to Iraq? I was curious.
I actually only spent like 6 weeks there in 2003.
Really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So I
Okay.
was embedded with the military with a group of paratroopers, and so I was before that I was with them in Italy. I couldn't convince the government lawyers to let me jump with them,
Oh,
although
that'd be
although
cool.
the colonel was quite eager.
Hmm.
It just never happened. But I got to fly in with them as 1,000 paratroopers jumped into the north, which was the start of my real embed. But yeah, that's my time there. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time in the Middle East, but the extent of my
Yeah.
my time in Iraq was like 5 or 6 weeks in 2003 at the start of the war.
Okay. Yeah. I was going in college. Like I would tell my professors, "Hey, on my spring breaks and trips, hey, I'm going over." So I was like going over to Iraq when I was in college. And
Wow.
my professors were cool about like, "Hey, yeah, you can go. We'll count this as a grade." And I was like, "Okay, sweet." Um and yeah, so I've been going since 2009 or 10, and every year I've been going, and this will be the first year I haven't made a trip. So,
Wow.
yeah, it's a special place to me. I have a lot of good friends, spent a lot of time in the Middle East and spent a lot of times in Africa, Asia, and I'm probably close to 40, so hopefully I'll
Hmm.
get to 100 at some point. But yeah, you probably have the best immune system, like there is.
Yeah, it's funny because I have friends who just fall by the wayside, and I subscribe to the Anthony Bourdain model where one of the best parts of my job is the interesting food. And so, I kind of sometimes exist in that gray area. If it looks interesting enough in a good way, where, I'll take a hit once a year, and
Yeah.
I've been pretty fortunate, especially in the Congo.
Oh yeah.
A lot of people get these amoebas and stuff. So knock on wood, I've been pretty fortunate. We are actually covering the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, and literally everyone on our team at our hotel, and I think they got it at the hotel, believe it or not.
Yeah,
It
that's
was a
probably right.
pretty decent hotel, and they all were down for the count, and
Mm.
somehow I escaped.
Not
Yeah.
fun, man. Not fun. You usually get
Nope.
that one really bad one, and then you're like good for a long
Yeah.
time, and then you kind of get here and there stomach aches or whatever. But then you're like after that one time, which really just knocks you on your butt, then you
You
usually
get
kind of
the,
yeah.
you get those words from you get these international travel doctors who'll say, "Well, congratulations, the parasites have colonized. You shouldn't have any trouble." It's kind of sounds like a Ridley Scott film or something, right? It's like, okay, they've colonized. I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah. Can you
Yeah.
I watched your 360 film on the Rohingya crisis. Which is, VR is something, I've been doing for a while and 360 video and still kind of work with that. What was it like just filming 360? I know like for me, a lot of people are like see that camera. And so it's hard to get for people to like shoot documentary with it because it draws a lot of attention. So what was it like filming 360 for you?
That was a really interesting assignment for me because I was there for. I mean, I went back and forth many times, but for that first stretch, that was like 3 years ago, right at the end of August when it started, and then I arrived early September. What made it challenging is a week in, I broke my leg,
Mm.
and it was monsoon season, and I wanted to go one way, and my leg wanted to go another, and I cracked my fibula and just tore up my ankle,
Oh,
and I was a mess. And so I went to a local doctor, and I said, if I'm not going to do any permanent damage, then I'm just going to have them throw a cast on it and stay. So it was painful in many ways, but it also gave me the freedom because I was also supposed to be doing video and photography. And then with the guy who hired me, I said, hey, let's do this VR film and let me do photography because I can't be running around with a tripod and a crutch. And
no way.
so it was actually great because the approach that I take with VR is I like to find an interesting scene, set the camera, and then get out of the way so people can acclimate to it. And sometimes you don't have that luxury if you're only somewhere for a week or two. But I think I was there shooting for 6 weeks, and so I could pick and choose my moments and film and get out of the way. So we were able to capture some interesting scenes that nobody else could touch. They might have, a $50,000 camera and this and that, but if you've only got a couple days and you want something to happen and it's not happening, you're not going to get it.
Exactly.
So there were a couple moments in particular that I was particularly proud of. There was a scene where this camp had been flooded, and so I was able to set up the camera in the water
Hmm.
uh, while the people were evacuating this camp. And there was another one and it was super painful and probably pretty stupid on my part because I kept breaking my casts because they were just plaster casts. So I didn't even have a cast this day, and I was crouched down in the back of a truck filled with new arrivals from Myanmar. And if somebody would have stepped on my foot, it just would have
Uh,
been game over, right? And so luckily, I kind of was covering my foot with one hand and holding the tripod. It was
dude,
actually a mic stand in one hand, and I had my black rain jacket over me to not screw up what you're
no
seeing.
way. No
Yeah,
way, man.
and I was just like, just gritting it, and whatever that was, like a 15-minute truck ride was just brutal. But I was proud of that. And to me, I love those kind of organic moments where you're not trying to be clever with it. You're just trying to go along in the journey because the Rohingya crisis was arguably the most powerful stories that I've covered, just because everyone told the same story of the horrible things happening
Right.
at the hands of the Burmese soldiers.
Yeah, that's the one thing I like about VR and 360. It forces you to tell something different than just kind of surface level, just based on it is, because it is hard. Because what I do like about it is when you film it, it's really hard. you can't hide very many things. Like
Mm-mm.
with a 2D camera, a regular camera, you can frame up certain things and make it look more dramatic, or how, you could do a lot of things with VR and 360 especially. You get what you get in a lot of ways. And so it does force you to like really think about where you're going to have to get this shot, in that story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you guys, hats off to you guys, and especially, Dave Dogg and Bryn Mooser. I mean, wow, they really did it right by jumping early on. I mean, they basically changed the DNA of Riot, right?
Yeah,
Back.
they went full force on it, and they did some incredible job, and they're still, now they're doing really, big time documentaries. And
Yeah.
so it's cool to see. And those times, like traveling and just filming and running around, like those are still some of my, hard times, but you always remember those stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you worked with Tyson Sadler at all? Do you know Tyson?
Oh yeah, I love Tyson. Tyson's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tyson's amazing, right? So I've been messaging him trying to I mean, I can't keep up with that guy, right? 'Cause,
Yeah.
he had a place in Utah that I'd crashed at a couple times when I'd be out there snowboarding, and usually he's out of the country,
Yeah.
and I think he's like diving in the Bahamas right now. And
Yeah, he's always like in the water taking photos of sharks, and I'm like, no
yeah,
way, man. I'm not doing
it
that.
it was pretty hilarious. So I've got two kids that I'm homeschooling while I'm back, and I was showing them photos and video that Tyson was posting of him swimming with sharks. And as I'm showing them, he starts posting about getting attacked by the shark that went for like his camera and sliced up two of his fingers. And
No
it just
way.
blew my kids' minds, right? Like, and then he posts pictures of the stitches. And I mean, that's, if you know Tyson, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. No, Tyson is one of my favorite people. He's a super nice guy. He came and visit Austin a few years ago. We got some tacos and stuff like that. He was still kind of recovering from his, injury that he had with his leg and stuff like that. I mean, from what he's told me, he says like, I'm lucky to be alive, kind of thing. And
It's
so,
true. I think he fell from like 35 feet.
oh
And
yeah, yeah,
I mean, a matter of millimeters, whether he lives or dies or,
yeah,
snaps his spinal column. So,
exactly.
yeah.
Traveling journalists, traveling independent photographers, that is a rough lifestyle when it comes to having a family, unless you meet, like I did. I got lucky. I met the right person, and there's still a lot of challenges there. It's not like there's not like it's always easy. But I was just curious, how is it with kids and family, and you've been doing this for a lot longer than I have. What's that like for you?
The ironic thing is, I think I spend more quality time with my kids, especially now, than most people I know. I've got friends, especially, if they're kind of married to their career where, they're lawyers or,
That's a good point.
whatever. And they might see their kids for a few minutes in the morning. They might catch them for an hour at night. Like I told my wife, when this coronavirus was taken off, I'm like, hey, when I come home, I'm not working for a long time, so I'll homeschool the kids. So we're out doing adventures. Like I don't care about standardized tests. I don't care about a curriculum. Let's read. Let's talk. Let's get excited about learning. And I've got two tests. One, are you happy? Two, are you excited about learning? Let's go. Right? So for me, it's also given them my experience abroad. And it's only possible because I've got a super cool wife who's understanding and who holds down the fort while
Okay,
I'm
cool.
gone.
So we're on the two.
Yeah, yeah. But when I'm back, when I'm gone, I can do, Skype calls or Zoom calls or FaceTime. And what I've been able to give them is the worldview that I didn't get as a child growing up, kind of isolated in Montana. So they know, oh, Daddy was in an earthquake in Nepal. Daddy was there covering the Rohingya. Daddy just spent 6 months in the Congo. What's the food like? What language do they speak? Oh, Goma, there's this volcano and it covered, a third of the city. What was that like? And so it's very exciting for them. And I got a globe for them. And so we go, and my wife messaged me as I was getting in the car yesterday. She said, "Hey, there's crazy tickets, $100 to Chile." I jumped
Whoa.
online and I'm like, "Hey, we're going to Chile in April. I hope it's all sorted by then. $400 for the whole family, round trip, direct flight." And so I've been trying to teach my kids Spanish since the day they were born, and now they have a reason to take it a little more seriously. And now it's like, hey, let's find it on a map. Let's start studying South America and Chile and the Andes until we get there. And even when I was in the Congo, I was supposed to have a shorter assignment, and I was going to come back, and we had cheap tickets to go on safari in Kenya. And
Hmm.
coronavirus happened, and so we had to postpone the trip. But I look for those opportunities, and it doesn't have to be super expensive. Our tickets to Kenya were $650 a piece, right?
Yes, that's not bad at all. Yeah.
So it's like, let's go there. Let's study, you know, the landscape. Let's study the animals. Let's study the local culture. Learn a little Swahili or whatever. And so they get excited about it. So it's tough for me and it's tough for them when I'm gone so much. But when I'm home, it's all
You're
hands on
home.
deck.
Yeah, and that's how I tell people too. When I was gone for so long and then come back, like we would, we think we appreciated each other more in a lot of different ways. Like we really took the time to understand, like, oh yeah, you do mean a lot, and there is something about that dynamic of being gone and coming back, and but that's really great. How's homeschooling, and how do you like
I,
that?
I love it. I'm fortunate that a friend of mine, he's got two daughters who are now adults, and he and his wife homeschooled them. And so he kind of gave me the confidence to make the jump. He basically said, "Hey, look, forget thinking like regular school. Like, stand back, get them excited, have them present them interesting things to study and to jump into, and let them run wild, you know?" And that's my children. My boy next week turns 8, my daughter is 6, and they learn very differently. And so for me, it's been a great adventure, and I'm lucky because they're both like nonstop readers. So that's half the battle, right? So they
That's
just,
Yeah,
yeah,
that reading is like the key for a lot of. I wish I did that way more. I was definitely more of a video game guy. I still am. That's like my hidden thing.
yeah.
But
So our curriculum, it's it's very heavy. I mean, they're in first and second grade. So there's a lot of Calvin and Hobbes.
oh,
I
cool.
got them guitars, so we're learning how to play guitar. My daughter's growing an organic garden that she's very excited about. My son draws nonstop, so they're happy. They're excited about learning. That's it for me.
Do you take photos of them all the time, or you kind of
Quite
just
a
put the
quite a bit,
camera down? Oh,
quite
okay.
a bit. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous too because it's been a very visual experience. So, a friend of ours, she has a wildflower garden, and she ordered some caterpillars, and they were forming chrysalises in the garden. She said, "Hey, do you want one of these? It's going to turn to a butterfly in a week." And I'm like, "Yeah." So we went over, and she explained to us kind of the life cycle. A caterpillar turns into the butterfly, and we clipped off this chrysalis and had it in our kitchen like 8 or 9 days, and I thought it was kind of drying up, and I'm like, it's not going to happen. And then one day, this amazing butterfly emerged,
Hmm.
and so I was able to photograph that moment too with my daughter and this journey, and the two of them seeing firsthand over the course of 9 days this journey of this creature turning into something, and then cheering as the butterfly, which they named Willie, flies out the window and off to wherever it's going. So there are these great adventures, these great moments. So for the past 3 days, we've been going on bike rides. Atlanta has a great system of trails that take you to interesting parks and playgrounds and museums. So it's like, hey, let's get going and see where it takes us. And it's a great metaphor for life, and they're super excited about it. And you can't get that even in a private school.
Yeah. Now you seem like you've done a really good job just mentally preparing and for this kind of job, like filming and telling stories where you go to places where you see just really sad things and just sad stories that can really just hurt a person in a lot of ways, or at least for me. And so I was just wondering how, because even just little things like interviewing like a little kid who has like the worst story you can hear, that over time, it can affect the person who's telling that story when you're constantly doing that. Even just like seeing a kid who's 5 years old trying to sell like a stick of gum, like even for me, that's like, just ignore or just like try to process it in a way. So I'm just wondering, after traveling over and over, do you try to process things in a different way, or, what do you try to do?
That's a great question. And let me say too, I really appreciate, the work and the discussions you've had with Christian addressing PTSD, among journalists, especially freelancers. I mean,
Yep.
it's getting more attention than it has been in the past. And it's really kind of unconscionable too, that a lot of these organizations, they just kind of like send people off and don't really take care of them once they get in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I've seen it from both sides. And when I'm doing work for a humanitarian organization or doing something with UNICEF, the good news is they're always trying to make the situation better. Sometimes they're able to succeed, sometimes not.
Right.
But when you're part of a solution, that makes it a lot easier. And even if I'm, doing straight up journalism or I'm somewhere else, I try to be a force for good, no matter how small. So my friend and I had a house in the Congo in Goma for 6 months. And there's a group of like a dozen street kids outside of our house. We're not going to make everything good for them, but we'd bring them a couple of loaves of bread and cheese every other day. It's not other people can do their part. That's what we could do, and we did it for 6 months. We gave them hundreds of loaves of bread, right? And it's a little bit. We try to help them out here and there. But to your point, I think it was about maybe 10 years ago, I reached a point where when you start to do more, especially covering natural disasters,
yeah,
you really come across human suffering on a scale you've never seen before. And I needed to make changes to be able to deal with that. And it feels kind of weird to say out loud, but I would find myself, especially when I'm doing still photography, where you really need to make a connection,
mm-hmm.
and then you spend time in post-production going through these photos. I just found myself, without realizing it, just finding myself crying a lot, right? When I'm going through these photos of suffering on a grand scale. And I had to get used to that. And I realized that was a good thing, because for me personally, I tried to just get in that place, isolate myself, and deal with it in the moment, processing the work, processing the feelings as I go. And that makes it possible, because you can't bottle that stuff up, because then it starts to wreck your home life. And even when I got back from Nepal, I mean, I was a wreck.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't sleeping. I actually was doing work, some UNICEF work. Before UNICEF got up and running, I was doing stuff for the New York Times. I was doing live shots with CNN multiple times a day. I was a wreck. I went back to my hotel and helped a couple tourists. We had to help dig out this guy, this Indian doctor who was trapped beneath his collapsed hotel, and he was the only one who survived, and he survived, and it was just overwhelming, and it wasn't until days and weeks and months later that some of that started to sink in. You've got all these dead bodies. I had to tell a group of women that their children had died in another building collapse. So I think you can't run from it. You need to process it, and I think there's a parallel with that and even with grief, and you have to deal with it on a certain level on its own terms, right? You can't say, I'm just going to do this and everything's going to be fine.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you develop a strategy, you try to deal with it, but then you have to expect it might rear up again. You
Mm-hmm.
might not be done dealing with it. It might be something. There are stories that I'm still haunted by to this very day that I still think about, and that make me a more empathetic human being, and it's part of the experience. But you're absolutely right. You need to. It's kind of like when the little yellow cup pops down on the airplane, right? You got to take care of yourself first, or you're not going to be able to tell anybody's story.
Yeah, I had a chance to talk to Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who he's like the leading expert of studying frontline journalists, like over 20 years. And some of the work he's done has really, help conversations of like journalists, you know, in a lot of ways experience conflict and war more than the average soldier, just because we do it for so long. And he was really interesting to listen to. He was like a medic during the Angola War, and and then he, you know, he's a psychiatrist, and he like he was saying to me and Christian that something does happen into your brain. Like you definitely have a change. And he was also good to point out that not all journalists have PTSD. Is still, but that number is still big. But he said if you're exposing yourself to trauma, he's like your brain actually does change in a lot of way. And he's like if you do not actually process it or talk about it or find a way that makes sense for you, yeah, you're gonna have go to drugs, booze, or you know who knows what. And so I had friends, you know, who definitely went to that side of the world, and they're still really struggling. And so
it's interesting too. I'm glad that there's been a change, because America has spent so much time at war since 9/11, and I'm friends with a guy who's a former Navy SEAL. And when he talks about it, he doesn't talk about PTSD. He talks about post-traumatic stress. Mm-hmm. He said, forget the disorder part. It's like, it's kind of a normal thing. If you go into these situations and you're losing your comrades, especially, I mean, in a military context, that's very stressful, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to have to deal with it. And sometimes it's not helpful. And I think even, you know, some of the more kind of a stereotypical tough guy might fight that label, you know, moving forward. But if you look at it as something, hey, it's post-traumatic stress, it's going to come up, let's deal with it. You know, let's deal with it now.
That.
Let's deal with it moving forward. And I think he was on Joe Rogan's podcast. His name is Andy Stumpf. He's an amazing individual. He's also like a wingsuit guy. You should have him on your podcast.
Oh,
He's got one.
Yeah,
and you should be on his as well. He's exceptionally articulate and thoughtful, and it made me rethink, you know, post-traumatic stress.
I like that.
In a very helpful way.
Taking the D out of it. Disorder. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's like, if you put yourself and you experience those things, like, that's what, you know, it already helps lighten up that phrase and makes it more sense to me. And so, do you, when you're in stateside, obviously you're resting and you're focusing on family. Do you ever like thought about, I want to do like a stateside story, you know, like, do you ever like, for me, it's hard to cover stateside stories. Like even like from the protests and stuff, I was like, I went into Austin, took photos, but I never even decided to try to get published or anything. I just felt like, I'll take it and save it and see what happens. But I'm just here to like learn. But I've always just been like, any pitching or any story I submit is always international. And I rarely pitch anything that's, you know, stateside. You know, I'll do more like marketing or video production type stuff just to make some side money. But I don't know. Is that with you? I don't know.
Almost exactly the same. I will say though, when the protests were really heating up after George Floyd, it was killing me not to be here. Especially, I appreciate. I mean, I love VR as a way to tell stories, but I think it. In my heart, I'm a still photographer. Like I just love the permanence of the image and the purity of the image, and seeing some of what was coming out. But you know, you look at a place like New York City, which is full of some of the best photographers in the world. It's just like, you know, there are a lot of people on the ground,
exactly,
their neighborhoods. But at the same time, another story that I was able to cover for CNN that I mentioned. Wow, I would have loved to, and would still love to, kind of embed with firefighters out in California, Colorado. I think you could relate to that too. It's a domestic story, but it's also kind of another planet, right?
Yeah.
Where you take something that's familiar and you flip it, and you're dealing with something entirely new. But I'm with you, and I think we're of the same breed in the sense that I appreciate sort of the chaos of natural disasters, and the freedom that it gives you. Some of these countries, they try to control everything.
Yeah.
And even in a case like Bangladesh with the Rohingya crisis, I happen to have spent, years going back and forth to Bangladesh, and I had covered the Rohingya crisis months before the big influx. And so having kind of an inside track, there weren't many restrictions. But then as things kind of stabilized, there are more and more restrictions. And now the government makes it so difficult even to get into the camps, where the work that I did before would be almost impossible.
Yeah.
So there's that time element where you've sometimes got a window to jump in there before everything's set in concrete, where it gives you this liberty to still tell stories in a way that you're not going to be able to in a week or a month or a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a few stateside stories that I have good access with, and those ones I'll try to do. And, some of it has to do with law enforcement. These type of law enforcement go after like top 10 most wanted, really, really awful people you don't even hear about in the news. And so that's one of the stories I want to do, just because I've spent a lot of time with them before. And I've also filmed, certain areas in Houston and Dallas, and, and filmed what's, going on in the inner city. And there is a lot of good stateside stories that need to be told. And I need to remind myself that, because it's just like right here, So I was wondering also, like, when you were in the DRC, is that situation, it's always such a fragile country, and a lot of things, almost everything happens in DRC, then it has a ripple effect for the rest of the continent. What's the current situation there? Is it, do you still have friends over there that you talk to, or, cause you were there for such a long period?
Oh yeah. I get messages every week from friends, especially Eastern Congo, which is almost a separate country from the West. And one of the interesting things about the Congo, it's such a huge country, and to me, it's the most interesting country in Africa. And the East, it's truly the Wild West. You have poverty juxtaposed with the richest mineral resources on Earth, and you have porous borders and a lack of infrastructure, a lack of roads. Like there's just a ridiculously small number of highways, asphalt highways in the country. Like, you can't drive from city to city. You can't drive from the east to the west, Kinshasa, uninterrupted. Yeah. And it's by design. And nobody really has a clear picture of who's getting what as far as the resources. You look at the proximity, with Rwanda, with Uganda, and the Congo, Eastern Congo, has the best and worst of humanity. You have these mineral resources, and you have wonderful individuals who get pinched by local fights, constant fights, even fights with different army factions within the national army. It's almost like they're franchises. Yeah. It's like you better be very aware of local intelligence and understanding what's truly happening. And so you have natural disasters, you have Ebola, you have COVID. It's just never ending, and it's cyclical. You've got malaria, you've got dengue. So there's no shortage of stories, and I'm sure I'll be back there in the spring. So
yeah, I remember watching Anthony Bourdain's film, one of his films on the Congo, and it was amazing. And so his work is probably, like every journalist, I think most journalists say, who's your favorite international journalist? Like, most of us would say probably Bourdain, even though he probably wouldn't call himself a journalist. But his work that he did in the Congo, and it was really, really good. Those guys were. Did you ever meet his team or anything like that while they're at CNN, or did you ever come close to them? Or
it's funny. It's kind of like the 6 degrees of separation, or 1 or 2 degrees of separation, because when he wound up at CNN, I had a lot of friends that would rub elbows with his team. But even then, he had a crazy small team. Like,
yeah, that's what I've heard.
Unit. So they were kind of doing their thing, and then he just kind of show up and, do some promos or whatever. But I mean, it was just, there are a handful of suicides, especially, that just
Yeah.
torment me. And his has to be at the top of the list because, wow, he was so inspiring, and just even his approach to the world on so many different levels. And he wasn't afraid to poke fun at himself, and just seemed like a cool, interesting guy who wasn't afraid to be authentic, no matter what that meant. He didn't have anything to prove to anybody. And I think, even getting back to your, who knows what was going on in his head. I mean, he'd been through some tough, heroin
You're right.
addiction and this and that, and nobody really can truly say they know where someone's head is at. But man, to see that guy go out the way that he did hurts.
Yeah, I know. Some of his projects, he just made documentary filmmaking look so easy in a lot of ways, but it looks so flawless in some of the projects that he's done. Even the one that he did in West Texas, like Big Bend area, it was so good. Man, this the level of research and the care that he has for the story, where a lot of times, even for me, it's like, oh yeah, I'll go shoot this and just go do it, But he really did care about storytelling. And
And what I appreciate about that storytelling too, coming from the TV world, where a lot of things, even if it's reality, it's carefully constructed. Okay, so the camera is going to come here, get you walking in, and then they're going to move the camera and get you shaking hands with Dylan or whatever. And it's carefully constructed, but it's presented to the world as reality. I remember him talking about their how they produce these stories, and it's just like, nope, let's roll the cameras. We're not going to redo it.
yeah, that's
If I come in there
crazy.
and somebody's like honking a horn, or there's a tractor driving down, and you can't, that's just the way that it is. Let's
Yeah.
just go with it.
Yeah.
And in the short term, it probably drove the higher ups nuts.
Probably.
But for the viewer, it makes it an authentic experience, and it's a good lesson. And it also makes it more kind of sustainable for him because, oh my God, I mean, he could just spend a never-ending amount of time, polishing and reshooting. Nope, This isn't David Fincher making a movie. We're not going to do 17 takes. We're going to shoot it. If we don't get it, then we got to move on and get something else to take its place.
Yeah, it must have been terrifying to be a DP at some points for him to get that. I mean, to get that shot, one take and everything in a crazy environment, such as like, Lebanon, which he was really known for, or, I think he did one in Nigeria that was really good. But yeah, Anthony Bourdain is like one of the few people that I remember the day that he died and remember that day. And so many journalists, we would say that's our favorite content creator in a lot of ways, but he's more like a filmmaker. Where would you like to go next after you take a break? Is there a specific area, or is just kind of like, whatever story sounds interesting for you?
I feel like my work isn't done in the Congo. So I'm looking forward to jumping back to the Congo. My career has evolved in a way that I've been fortunate to be able to do some deep dives. And I like, when there's a natural disaster, I like getting in there early and spending a lot of time there, and even revisiting it, even, a couple of years later. Like, I've loved returning to Haiti and seeing where things are, so many years later. And I guess one area of the world that I haven't spent much time, it's just the way that it plays out sometimes, right? Like, you go where you're hired to go most of the time. And a lot of these places I've gone over and over, Haiti 50 times. I've probably done Afghanistan 6 or 7 times, India over a dozen times. I've spent, 10 months in the Congo over the past couple of years. But there's parts of Asia that I've just not visited at all. Funny enough, even like Thailand. I've never
really?
even been. I haven't even been to
Philippines?
the airport. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the Philippines, though.
Okay.
Yeah, I spent a fair amount in the Philippines. I spent 2 months on a little island after they had a big typhoon hit.
Right. Yeah.
Tacloban, but Vietnam, Cambodia. So I'm looking forward, at some point to checking out that part of the world. China. I spent 24 hours in Hong Kong, but China. But I've really appreciated the deep dive in the Congo and look forward to exploring more of it. And even I think I'm at a point too, spending some time where work on some personal projects, regardless of who's signing the check. Go do my work there, stick around. I mean, there are literally endless stories, and I brushed up against some of them. Traveling down a river and just seeing these ramshackle diamond mines,
Right.
and talking with these young kids who will be there camped out for 2 months, barely getting by, spearing these piranha-looking fish in the river, and 7, 8 weeks before they see anything, right?
Dang.
So it's just like that mentality. So I'm looking forward to return to the Congo.
Is we always hear about minerals and cell phones being built, and if you have an iPhone, there's chances are some of these minerals came from areas that use kids for being slaves and working and stuff like that. What's your take on that whole issue, like such in the Congos? Like, is there large businesses trying to like really try to like find minerals, or is it just more of like a militia kind of stuff, bad actors within a lot smaller scale, that kind of thing? So
I think it's an ugly side of the reality of the world. If you have an exceptionally rare element that's a necessary component of cell phones, they'll do whatever it takes to get that element, right? I don't think we have a true picture. There have been some great documentaries, let's
right.
track, like, here's my cell phone, let's track down, and find out where this came from. And at the end of the line, you'll find, this kid in a mine. I think there's a lot more of that than the world acknowledges. And so I'm a huge supporter of any kind of project that sheds more light on the reality, because the reality of so many things in the world, even recycling in the United States, we think we're so good and virtuous by putting our recycling in the blue can.
Right.
Well, what happens when it goes there?
I
You,
don't
you hear
know.
about these stories where, oh, we're selling it to China, but now China's not taking anymore. So now they're dumping it in the ocean. So is it just this facade? I think there's a certain intellectual dishonesty among Americans in particular, where we like to think that we're kind of floating above the ether and we're doing the right thing in so many ways. But at the same time, we're just this monster consuming
Yeah.
resources. Like, let's just be honest about it. Like, we're not giving up our cell phones. I don't have a Tesla. We're not giving up our Teslas. We're not giving up this. People say, oh, the Tesla, preserves fossil fuels, but what about the batteries used in the Tesla? So I just wish there was a greater appetite for intellectual honesty. And I
Exactly.
think sort of this revolution with Netflix and Amazon Prime and now Apple TV, where there's a place, there's a home for documentaries that I might produce, or you might produce, or Tyson might produce, or Dave Darg or Bryn Moose or whatever. I think people, the more they're giving this unvarnished look at the world, you can't live in denial,
Hmm.
right?
Exactly.
So that's kind of my take. And I've spent a fair amount of time in the Congo, and I think I'm at a place where I'm starting to understand. I'm starting to know what I don't know,
It's
right? Like,
very
it's like,
complicated. It's not like, because to do a documentary on it, it would require years almost of just spending time in the country, and like you have to. I like that's why I kept going to Iraq, because I've made so many connections, made so many friends, and you can't just spend 2 weeks there and figure everything out. It requires so much time of just being there and connecting with people and networking and figuring out, because anyone can come up to you and tell you something, and you have to like spend some time. And so yeah, I completely agree about the honesty and being transparent, like, because like it can only help educate people if we're just being open about it. I guess one of the last things, like, regarding like just the industry and freelance and journalism, to me, I think getting published is still, when I talk to young freelancers who are starting out, I was like, yeah, go get published. But I don't know if being published has the same meaning, getting, meaning as far as getting more work is what it used to be, even like in 2015. Like when I got published with like Vice and The Economist and Vice News, I kept getting more work and work after that. But I don't know if that's that. It's almost like just a checkpoint, just because a story now these days maybe has like an hour life shelf, maybe a day life shelf. So I was just curious what your take just in freelance journalism. Like for me, I enjoyed producing my own stories. I'm not going to make any money off it, but I have a good side gig that I'm making a living off of. I'll probably go back to traveling at some point. But I enjoy just telling my own stories and focusing on YouTube and podcasts. I think the premier, like if you want to get published, is like Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Apple. Those are the premier where your careers could take off. But that's almost like winning the lottery in a lot of ways. And not quite that hard, but requires a certain pitch and networking. So that's just kind of my take. I was kind of curious what you thought about that.
It's interesting. I've gone back to my journalism school and spoken to students a few times over the years. And one of the bits of advice, and I rarely like to give anyone advice, but one of the few bits of advice I gave to them was, don't be a jerk. Because as good as you are, as good as you think you are, that network matters.
Yeah.
And you can have an amazing story, but if it doesn't have a home, it doesn't exist. It's the tree that falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it. A perfect example, too, and one of the most inspiring examples is Dave Darg's Ebola documentary from West Africa, right?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Dave was there, actually, I think, at first with his group, Operation Blessing, doing humanitarian work, and then he stumbles on this amazing story, and rarely does anyone have the luxury of doing this, but he shot this thing, it's like less than 15 minutes, but they kind of already had a home for it and a platform with Riot. And then Bryn is so good on the other side of things that it attracted attention. And he was able to bring on, Paul Allen as an executive producer and whoever else. And all of a sudden it starts to attract attention because it was a great story. Mm-hmm. And it gets nominated for an Oscar, and then HBO steps in. So what does a new guy starting out take away from that? I think you go and you get the great stories, but along the line, you're going to meet interesting people. And if it's good enough and somebody, at the New York Times or Vice or CNN or whatever, the format is, if it's an incredible story, it's going to find a home.
Yeah.
You can't worry about monetizing it straight out of the gates because you have no track record. Right?
Exactly.
You do need a certain pedigree to attract attention moving forward, because that's a huge part of the freelancer's equation, right? It's like, how do I keep doing this and paying the bills, especially if you've got, a couple of kids or whatever, and now COVID's presenting all of these challenges. So there are new platforms. It's a matter of finding these platforms, and whether that means kind of creating your own brand, which can be very difficult, or, subsisting on work through particular clients and then doing personal projects, which I'm still looking at doing now. Like,
yeah.
I've got bills and a mortgage and kids, and
yeah.
And if somebody can send me someplace to do a paid gig, hey, it's no big deal for me to stick around for 2 or 4 weeks and do my own thing. So, first and foremost, you go find the great stories and then try to find the best home for it. And if you have a network, if you know people along the way and you support one another. I mean, one of the things I love doing, and I know you love doing, just by looking at the people that you talk with and work with, how do we help each other out? How do we support our friends? And we're all going to rise together in a certain sense. It's just like, if you look out for people, and that's one of the things I appreciate too. Of course, there's a competitiveness. Everyone wants to get the best story. But come on, man, if someone does some great work,
good for
here's
them.
My contact here, and then if I get the great story in a month or a year, you can help me out. I mean, it's tough enough, and part of it too is that camaraderie makes the journey worthwhile. Like, mm-hmm. it's tough enough, and you never know what story is going to resonate on what platform. So part of it too is just like a startup company. How do you get more at bats, right? Like, you don't want to just go out there and spend all this time and get this great story and not get paid for it. So it's a delicate balance too, right?
Right. No, I being a good person in this industry is probably the best advice for a lot of people, because you can easily just go off on someone. It's like, oh, being trustful with one another. That could be a difficult thing for someone, starting out, or be jaded or whatever like that. But a lot of it is just like, that's just part of the business. That's just part of what it is. But if you can just try to be kind to one another, it could go a long way. And so, no, I like that part. Well, Thomas, thanks for spending some time with me. I know it's not quite like CNN, but it's getting up there. And so
I love this format. The podcast, I just drove across country and was just like queuing up the Joe Rogan podcast.
Oh, the best.
It's a great platform. So I love these long conversations. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.